wind howled across Ironcliff Bridge that night, dragging with it a biting chill that crept beneath coats and gloves and right into the bones. But Thomas Kane didn't feel it, didn't even flinch, his eyes locked instead on the old man beside him, Mr. Harold Leston, a name once whispered with awe in business circles, now reduced to a fragile frame of trembling limbs and weary breath. And yet, as they stood there, beneath the rusted lamppost flickering against the fog, Harold's voice remained as calm as ever, laced with confusion and concern more than fear. "Thomas, why are we here? It's nearly midnight." And Thomas, jaw tight, fingers fidgeting inside his pocket, didn't answer immediately, instead staring out at the black water below, where city lights shimmered like broken glass, a place where secrets could be swallowed and never seen again. Because this wasn't a spontaneous act, it had festered for months, grown from whispers of resentment to full-bloomed hatred, from long nights nursing whiskey and bitterness to the decision that tonight the suffering would end, his and maybe the old man's too, because Thomas believed wrongly, but deeply, that Harold was the root of everything wrong in his life. The stagnant job, the overlooked promotions, the times he was scolded in front of peers, and worst of all, the dismissive tone Harold used, that same quiet voice of a man who trusted you but never believed in you. And yet, as Thomas gripped the rusted edge of the bridge and stepped closer to his boss, heart hammering in his ears louder than the distant traffic, he failed to notice the silhouette hidden beneath the fog, not 10 feet away, crouched low and unmoving behind a crumbling concrete barrier. Rex, Harold's loyal German shepherd, who had followed them from the apartment without a sound, trained not just to protect, but to observe, to listen, and to wait for the moment something felt wrong. And everything felt wrong now. The tension, the silence, the shift in Thomas's eyes from uncertainty to intent. And as Thomas suddenly stepped forward, hand on Harold's shoulder, shoving the old man with more strength than one would guess he had, the scene happened in seconds, too fast for Harold to scream or brace or even understand. And then the splash, the finality of it, swallowed by the river as if it had never happened. And Thomas just stood there, panting, hands trembling, whispering to himself, "It's done, it's finally done," unaware that behind him, eyes wet from the wind, or maybe grief, Rex watched it all, unmoving, silent, but storing every detail with the focus of a creature who had once been trained to detect bombs and read micro-expressions on enemy faces in war zones. A dog whose instincts had saved soldiers and civilians, and who now understood, as deeply as any person could, that something terrible had just been taken from him. Thomas walked away without looking back, convinced the river had swallowed the only witness, already imagining the fabricated story of how Harold must have wandered out and fallen by accident, how Thomas had tried to save him but arrived too late. And maybe, in his arrogance, he even smiled slightly as he walked down the path, brushing fog from his coat. Unaware that Rex had already begun to follow, his paws quiet against the cold stone, not with rage, but with purpose, because loyalty didn't die with breath, and love didn't vanish into rivers. It became resolve, and the days that followed unfolded like a slow burn mystery, the kind that wraps around the soul and pulls tighter with each unraveling truth. Starting with the phone call to the police, Thomas's voice feigning panic, and the official search that ensued: boats, divers, drones, but no body found. Not yet, just Harold's wallet near the edge of the bridge and Thomas's eyewitness account. But when the officers returned to Harold's apartment to collect personal items, they found Rex waiting at the door, refusing to move, growling low every time Thomas came close, even as he tried to sweet-talk the dog with Harold's old phrases and treats from the cupboard. And though the officers chalked it up to canine confusion, a detective named Marla Greaves took note of the dog's behavior and found herself returning alone one evening, just to sit with Rex and observe. And what she found surprised her. Every time she mentioned Harold's name gently, Rex would whimper, look toward the window, then the front door, then back at her with pleading eyes, as if trying to speak the things he couldn't say. And something about that haunted look in the dog's face reminded her of a case years ago, a child witness too traumatized to talk who communicated everything with eyes and gestures. And Marla, patient and thorough, decided to investigate deeper than the paperwork demanded. And slowly, threads began to loosen. Harold's financials were in good shape. No signs of dementia. No record of instability. Why would he walk onto a bridge alone late at night? Why was there no sign of distress in his journals, emails, or habits? And more importantly, why was Thomas's key fob logged at the bridge 15 minutes earlier than he claimed in his statement? A minor inconsistency, but enough to raise suspicion. And as Marla dug deeper, she also kept visiting Rex, forming a bond, discovering that this old war dog still had sharp senses and sharper memory, because when she brought out photos of Harold's employees and laid them on the floor, Rex ignored most, sniffed a few, but growled a deep, low rumble the moment he saw Thomas's face, and didn't stop until she took the photo away. And it wasn't definitive evidence, not by legal standards, but it was enough for Marla to request surveillance from nearby traffic cams, hoping for even a glimpse of the two men walking, standing, anything. And days later, they found it, a fuzzy frame in the distance, but unmistakable. Two figures on the bridge, Harold leaning gently against the railing, Thomas closer than necessary. And as Marla stared at that image, she felt her gut tighten. Something wasn't right, and back at the precinct, Thomas began to crack under the slow press of suspicion, especially when Marla, without directly accusing him, simply showed up with Rex one day and asked, "Do you mind if he comes in?" And Thomas, pale and sweating, tried to act calm, But Rex immediately bristled, stepping between Marla and Thomas, as if shielding her from something unseen. And Thomas stammered, "He doesn't like me, never did." But Marla only nodded, watching his eyes, seeing how they darted, not with grief, but with guilt. And days turned to weeks. And though the river eventually did give up Harold's body, lodged against a far embankment, too decomposed for exact details, the bruising around the wrists and neck suggested more than a fall. And soon enough, with pressure mounting and evidence slowly aligning, Thomas finally broke, confessing not out of remorse, but fear of the mounting whispers, the strange dreams, the way people looked at him differently, and most of all, fear of a dog who had followed him home one night and sat outside his door until morning, silent and still, like a ghost refusing to be buried. And when it was over, when the trial passed and Thomas was sentenced, and reporters wrote their headlines and moved on, Rex remained not as a witness now, but as a survivor, a keeper of truth. And when Marla officially adopted him, she did so not out of pity, but respect, because Rex wasn't just a pet, he was legacy, justice, and a living reminder that the bond between human and dog doesn't break with betrayal. It strengthens in the face of it. And years later, long after the case had become just another file in the archives, Marla and Rex would still walk the bridge some evenings, stopping at the exact spot, the fog curling around them like memory. And she would kneel beside him, scratch his graying ears, and whisper, "You did good, boy." And Rex, old but proud, would lift his head to the wind, nose twitching, ears alert, forever watching, forever loyal, forever guarding the truth no one thought he could tell, though the courtroom proceedings had come to an end. And justice had, in the eyes of many, been served. Life didn't simply resume with a clean slate, because grief, true, lingering grief, rarely obeys the rules of gavel and judgment. And for Marla Greaves, who had grown used to the silence of crime scenes and the sterile logic of procedure, it was the presence of Rex that reminded her daily that this case hadn't just been about evidence or guilt, but about love lost, trust betrayed, and a life stolen beneath the fog. The German shepherd had settled into her small home on the edge of the city, like a retired soldier might settle into a final post, quiet, watchful, and weary, but not broken, never broken. And each morning he would rise before her, pacing briefly at the door, as though awaiting Harold's footsteps, then retreating to the kitchen, where Marla kept his bowl beside a worn mat with faded paw prints. And on most days, she would speak to him like an old friend rather than a dog, updating him on small things, the news, her colleagues' gossip, the slow crawl of paperwork, or the cases that failed to ignite her attention the way this one had. But despite the routine, something lingered beneath it all, a restlessness in Rex that even long walks or playtime in the park couldn't erase, as if the dog still had unfinished business, or perhaps, Marla feared, a soul still waiting for closure, and that idea stayed with her one evening when she returned home late from a conference and found Rex not at the door, but in the back garden, staring intently at the fence, unmoving, his ears stiff and tail low. And when she called out, he didn't turn, only growled softly, not in fear, but in a way that made her hair stand on end. And she followed his gaze to the alley beyond, seeing only shadows, hearing only the distant clatter of a bottle rolling. Maybe a raccoon or a drunk, she thought, but Rex's posture said otherwise. It was the stance of a guardian detecting not a threat, but a presence. And the next morning, she found a note tucked into her mailbox with no stamp, just a single line in smudged ink. He wasn't the only one, and her stomach dropped, not from fear, but from the gnawing echo of unfinished stories. And as she sat at her kitchen table, turning the note over in her fingers, Rex sat beside her, watching her expression, his body tensing slightly whenever her thumb passed the crease in the paper. And it was then she realized this wasn't over, that Harold's death had been the end of a rope, whose beginning was still buried somewhere deeper, darker, and more dangerous. And the next week was a blur of reopened files and quiet phone calls to old contacts, most of whom remembered Harold Leston as a hard but fair man, a businessman who had built his wealth ethically, at least on paper. But when Marla dug into the history of Leston's company, she discovered a string of fired executives, 3 of whom had gone bankrupt shortly after their dismissals, and one Jonas Cleves, who had disappeared altogether. His case labeled voluntary relocation, but the records were vague and the trail cold until Marla noticed something strange. All 3 firings had one thing in common. Thomas Kane was involved, either as an advisor, an internal auditor, or an assistant during the transitions. Always low profile, always peripheral, but always present. And suddenly, Harold's murder didn't feel like a crime of passion or opportunity, but something deeper, a puzzle with pieces deliberately scattered. And as she followed the breadcrumbs through archived emails and anonymous tips, she uncovered what seemed to be a pattern of quiet, methodical sabotage, career assassinations, not always fatal in body, but devastating in effect. And what made it worse was the creeping sense that Thomas had not been alone, that he was part of something bigger, or at least protected by it. And as she drove through fogged streets one evening, thinking of how many people had ignored the signs, she looked at Rex in the passenger seat, his eyes alert as always, and whispered, "What if Harold wasn't just a victim of betrayal, but a whistleblower?" And in that moment, something in her resolve crystallized, because justice wasn't just about punishing killers. It was about protecting the truth, and truth, she was learning, often came with a heavy cost. And over the next month, as whispers turned to rumors and names began to surface, old partners, forged audits, false accounts, Marla found herself being followed, her home phone ringing with silence at odd hours, her internet throttling to a crawl without explanation. And one evening, as she returned from the grocery store, she noticed the back gate open and Rex standing motionless inside the kitchen, fur raised, a low growl rising in his chest. And when she stepped inside, hand on the pepper spray in her coat, she found nothing missing, nothing obvious, but the air felt wrong, charged, like someone had stood in that very room minutes earlier, breathing, watching. And for the first time in her career, Marla considered that the danger wasn't just past, it was hunting. And she wasn't the only target, because if someone was willing to kill Harold and bury the secrets he knew, they'd do the same to anyone digging too close. And yet, she kept digging. Each late night, spent under the glow of her study lamp, with Rex curled by her side, each breakthrough carefully documented in an encrypted folder named Loyal. And finally, after tracing a series of offshore accounts connected through layers of shell companies, she found a link, a financial thread tying Leston Corp to a dubious investment firm known for laundering money through charities and real estate. And Thomas Kane's name, buried within those documents under a pseudonym, proved he wasn't just a disgruntled employee. He was a facilitator, maybe even a pawn. And as she prepared her findings for the district attorney, she received an unmarked package on her porch. No return address, and inside was a flash drive containing audio grainy, but unmistakable Thomas's voice arguing with another man about the old fool who found the numbers. And Marla knew, deep in her gut, that this was the final nail, but she also knew it meant her time was limited, because the people involved wouldn't sit still while she prepared indictments. And she was right. 2 nights later, her brakes failed on a winding road outside the city, and it was only Rex's barking and sudden leap into the front seat that made her slow enough before the curve to avoid crashing into the ravine, his weight pulling the steering wheel just enough, his body absorbing the jolt that would have shattered her skull. And though he limped for days afterward, the vet said it could have been worse. And Marla knew without doubt, that Rex had saved her life again, just as he had tried to save Harold's. And when she stood before the grand jury weeks later, files in hand, Rex waiting patiently outside the courthouse doors, she felt a surge of purpose, not born from vengeance, but from love, from a dog's unbreakable loyalty that had turned grief into a mission. And when the indictments came down, and names were read aloud on the news, and the scandal broke like a tidal wave across every business station in the country, Marla didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She just drove home, unlocked the door, and sat beside Rex on the floor, resting her head gently on his fur, whispering, "We did it." And he licked her cheek once, softly, eyes half closed, as if he'd been waiting all this time to hear those words. And outside, the wind moved through the trees, not with menace now, but with peace. The following months flowed by in quiet waves, no longer punctuated by the chaos of late-night research or the hum of hidden threats. but instead by something both more difficult and more beautiful healing. And while the nation was still reeling from the scandal, headlines exploding with names and details of money trails, betrayals, and once powerful individuals brought to their knees, Marla found herself avoiding the spotlight as best she could, declining interviews and ducking awards ceremonies, choosing instead to spend her time in the quiet company of Rex, whose presence had shifted from that of a guardian to a partner in silence, the kind who needed no words to say everything, and their days took on a rhythm that suited them: early walks through dew-covered trails, midday visits to the cemetery, where Harold now rested beneath a modest stone engraved with the words "truth" above all, and evenings on the porch, where Marla would sip coffee and Rex would rest his head on her feet, eyes scanning the horizon as though still watching for ghosts. And it was during one of those evenings, as golden light spilled across the worn wood of the porch, that Marla received a letter, not digital, not typed, but handwritten on parchment-like stationery, the kind no one used anymore. And it bore a name she hadn't heard in over a year: Clara, Harold's estranged daughter, who had vanished from the media's eye after the funeral, turning down every inheritance, selling off the family estate, and disappearing into some remote place overseas. But now her words were gentle, filled with gratitude, speaking of how she had watched from afar, unable to face the ruins of what her father had built, but inspired by the unwavering loyalty of a dog and the determined heart of a detective who had refused to look away. And at the end of the letter, she asked for only one thing: if you and Rex would ever consider visiting the vineyard he loved, there's something I'd like you to see. And a month later, Marla and Rex found themselves driving through rolling hills under a sun that painted everything in warmth, arriving at a small, rustic vineyard tucked between quiet valleys, where Clara waited with open arms and tired eyes. And after introductions and shared tears, she led them through the vines to a small house Harold had once dreamed of retiring in a dream he'd never spoken of to many, but which Clara had preserved in his memory. And there, nestled beside the veranda, stood a newly unveiled bronze statue, not of Harold, but of Rex, cast mid-stride, gaze fixed forward, alert and unwavering. And beneath the sculpture was a plaque that read, "Loyalty sees what the world overlooks," and Marla knelt beside it, running her fingers over the etched letters as Rex sniffed at the base, then laid down beside it, as though understanding this was hallowed ground. And Clara placed a hand on Marla's shoulder and whispered, "He loved that dog more than anything. He said if the world ever turned against him, Rex would still believe." And Marla nodded, because that was the truth, a truth more unshakable than any court ruling or financial audit. And as they spent the evening sipping wine beneath stars that shimmered like distant memories, Clara shared stories of Harold, who he had been before the empire, the boy who once saved a drowning kitten, the man who read poetry on rainy nights, And Marla listened, letting those images replace the last ones she had of him. The cold, lifeless figure pulled from the river, and she realized that this was closure, not just injustice, but an understanding, in seeing someone's full arc, not just their final chapter. And as she and Rex stayed on the vineyard for a week, exploring the hills and watching the sun rise over fields he may have once dreamed of walking with Harold, she noticed that Rex had begun to soften, his gait less hurried, his eyes more at ease. And though he still sat by the window at dusk, as though waiting for someone, it no longer carried the sting of loss, but the patience of remembrance. And when it was finally time to leave, Clara handed Marla a box, small, carved from cedar. And inside it was Harold's old journal, worn and fragile, filled with handwritten notes and passages, some of which detailed the very suspicions that had cost him his life, and others, more surprising, spoke of Rex in tender prose, describing dreams he'd had of the dog leading someone braver than me to the truth. And Marla closed the journal gently, her throat tightening as she realized Harold had known, maybe not all the details, but enough to suspect his time was limited, and still he had chosen to trust the loyalty of a dog to carry forward what he could not. And with the journal now resting in her home library and Rex sleeping by the fire each night, Marla began writing, not case reports or affidavits, but a book, part memoir, part investigation, part ode to a dog whose heart never wavered. And the book, titled Rex, The Last Witness, would go on to touch hearts across the world, not for its scandal or mystery, but for the truth it held in every line about what it means to love, to believe, and to follow that belief even when the world goes dark. And in the years that followed, as time weathered the corners of her home and the edges of her memory, Marla would sometimes sit in the garden and watch the sun cast long shadows across the grass, where Rex now moved slower, grayer, but no less proud. And she knew that someday he too would leave, as all good souls must, but that when he did, it would not be into oblivion, but into legend. And sure enough, one winter morning, as snow whispered against the windows, and the world lay in silence, Rex passed in his sleep, head resting on the very journal Harold had left behind. And Marla buried him beneath the old oak tree where he loved to nap, marking the grave with a stone carved not with his name, but with the words Harold had once written. He saw everything and still chose love. And in the years that followed, people came not to ask about the case, but to leave flowers, notes, and toys at the statue in the vineyard or the grave by the oak, and children would run their fingers along the etched bronze of Rex's statue and ask, was he real? And Marla would smile and say, he was the most real thing I've ever known. And somewhere, in the hush of twilight, as the wind moved gently through the trees, the world remembered not the scandal, not the betrayal, but the dog who had watched, waited, and never turned away. Because in the end, this was not a story of crime, but a legend of loyalty. and legends, when told beneath the moonlit muzzle of memory, never truly